Okay, welcome to the October 2020 Learning Health System Collaboratory. Today we're going to be not just talking about learning health systems as drivers of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really thinking through how we can continue this dialogue and how we can transform the dialogue into action that actually makes a difference moving this forward. First, some housekeeping items. The session is being recorded. The recording link is going to be shared with everyone via email if you've registered and attended. The session is going to be closed captioned, and we're going to ask everyone to please be actively engaged in posting questions for speakers in the Q&A pod feature on Zoom and throughout the entire session. So let's begin. First, I have some required disclosures. And many of you might know me from my role as the program officer in the Department of Learning Health Sciences here at the Michigan Medical School. But I also serve as executive director of the Cantor Family Foundation. I'm the founding president and CEO of a nonprofit called the Learning Health Community, and I'm president of the board of directors of PAVE. Two of those three are very involved in learning health systems as well, and very complementary and synergistic with what we're doing at Michigan. And I will actually be mentioning the learning health community in passing in this work. So look, we're here because over 50 years ago, Martin Luther King pointed out that injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane form of inequality. And we, as a core, everyone here is sort of engaged with learning health systems, and we really believe that, beyond just striving to do no harm, learning health systems have the potential to serve as forces for bringing about justice in healthcare and in health. They can be powerful drivers of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And they're really anchored in core values that are all about principles like inclusiveness and transparency and accessibility and multi-stakeholder cooperative leadership. And their main goal is really about efficiently and equitably serving learning needs of all participants and the public good. So I think this can really make that happen. We're going to be hearing from people who are on the front lines as thought leaders and doers about really taking the transformative power of LHSs and of help and bringing it to really doing something about improving health equity and making health care more just and equitable. If you think about this past year or so, the forces that sort of intersect with healthcare and public health and social justice, just you can't miss it because they're part of the fabric of what's most important now in society. It's sort of, you began with the Time Person of the Year was this young woman who was bringing about realization of the importance of climate change and climate justice and environmental justice. And then, COVID came about, and it couldn't be more obvious from the disparate impacts of COVID, how unjust healthcare and health is. And another major public health threat, rose to the forefront of the national consciousness, which is, racial injustice in society and social injustice. So I think, again, learning health systems can be a major player in really writing these things. It's about moving that forward. If you look at the literature, this is all over the place in terms of just recognizing the importance and moving it forward. You can see that the very algorithms, the machine learning, the access to care, artificial intelligence are not just embedding biases in many ways, sort of making them even more obvious, and they may be making things more inequitable. And then COVID in its own right is just very obviously having really disparate impacts on people. And it's our challenge and our goal is to change that. Fortunately, we have absolutely amazing people at Michigan and doing things in this whole space. Just a few examples, and there would be too many to list. I just picked two, which is in our Department of Learning Health Sciences, we have Emily Coulter Thompson, who's been actually doing amazing work on LGBTQ health equity and has been speaking about it and really transforming it. And we have a grant that goes across Michigan, across several schools, from google.org to really look at equity associated with the virtualization of care. I'm guessing a lot of people have been watching the presidential debates. If we've learned one thing about from the very first debate anyway, it's you can't just have three old white guys doing it. It takes more than that. If you leave it just three old white guys, you saw what happened at the first debate. Now, I am not an old white guy yet, but I'm an old white guy in training. I'm actually visiting my parents in Boca Raton, Florida, which is the perfect place to do your residency for that, apparently. If you haven't heard of Boca Raton, it was the one of the inspirations for Seinfeld's Del Boca Vista, and I'll leave it at that. But anyway, the whole point is you really need much more diversity in all of this. You need people represented. We'll be hearing from people on the panel who've really done that, but I just wanted to highlight that there is a field already in this, and one of our panelists, Danielle, is actually a leader in really thinking through how to bring equity into learning health systems and developing frameworks and things like that. I will just continue. In the literature I mentioned earlier, the one that really has struck me was this idea. I maybe should have learned this word a while ago, but the word syndemic I had not heard even in public health school. But it's the idea that is really what's happening is not just this infectious virus that's spreading, but you have the synergy of that, this sort of destructive synergy of that, and all kinds of other problems in society that are coming together, and you can't just solve it. It's affecting the most vulnerable in the harshest ways, and you can't just solve it by thinking about it purely as an infectious disease. You have to take this larger vision that encompasses social science, encompasses thinking about how you bring education, housing, food, environment, and other solutions into it. And we at Michigan are so perfectly positioned to play a leadership role in that, because of we have so many top programs in all these things, and we know how to work together really well, and that's what makes Michigan such a powerhouse. And we're ready to move forward on that. So our learning cycles, if you think about them, the very beginning of a learning cycle is forming a community of interest, and that's the whole point. It's not about a learning health system is not driven by an individual; it's driven by communities, and it's exactly that reason why we need these learning communities to be diverse, to represent people that are affected, and to really bring diversity in terms of different kinds of thinking, different disciplines, different perspectives. People from different walks of life coming together to solve problems that they all care about. And then from there, at every single point on the learning cycle, there's an opportunity from capturing data from diverse sources and people to making sure the knowledge gets where it needs to go. There's opportunities at every point on our learning cycle that we're also familiar with to really advance this, and that's what we're here to try to make happen. We also, at Michigan, I just wanted to give a shout out. We are some of the thought leaders and sort of the big conveners on ethical, legal, and social issues in learning health systems. And I would just encourage everyone to really look at that, because that's part of what's anchoring all of this is that thinking. Beyond that, again, sort of switching hats. This is my learning health community hat. You think about the origins of LHSs as being something that a lot of folks are talking about and working on and doing. This is almost 8 years ago. The community began by developing a set of core values that would drive this vision forward, and that was the dream. And these values are all about inclusiveness, about accessibility, about everyone benefiting and everyone participating. It's about bringing lots of folks in, and that's if you anchor it in that, that's how you can get to really changing things. So in terms of thinking about an approach, I just wanted to take a little of the story of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who really did in her amazing life, what she did was she had this vision of a much more equitable future, and she just realized you have to go step by step and chisel away at the things that are impeding it, and do some positive things to make it happen, and just keep going step by step towards that vision, and don't give up, and take it one step at a time. And I think that can be our shared challenge with learning health systems, is to make that happen. So you think about what our call to action with this socio-technical infrastructure that we've thought about building and creating. I think I would propose a challenge that in every step, in every learning health system we pilot, and everything that we do, can we take a little step towards reducing injustice? Can we take a little step towards positively advancing DEI, making things better? Can we integrate DEI into the very fabric of what we're trying to do and make happen from the outset, from how it's planned, from who's involved, from who we listen to, from who's in the driver's seat, and every one of these things? Can we take each thing as one step forward along this progression towards this better vision, and we keep growing the community to make this happen? So I think that's the challenge. I'm now going to turn it over to some speakers who are really experts at making this happen and have lived it. And the plan for the day, again, is we're going to start out with this fireside chat format, where I'll be, as the moderator, asking some questions, and each of the speakers will be addressing them. And from there, we really want to actively engage everyone else who's on the collaboratory today in coming up with some questions and engaging, and we'll have a dialogue in sort of the second half of this thing. So looking forward to moving that forward. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the three speakers. You can see their names here. It's Luis Belen, Danielle Brooks, and Melissa Creary, who's from Michigan. And what I'm going to be doing is, instead of me introducing them as a moderator, I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves, tell us a little about what they do and how it relates to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how it intersects with learning health systems. So now I'll be quiet for a little while and ask each of them to start to answer that. And I guess we'll begin with Luis and go in this order for the first round of questions. Luis, Danielle, and Melissa.
Josh, thank you for having us. This is an extremely important topic for us. Let me just give you some quick background about the National Health IT Collaborative for the Underserved. NHIT was launched, and there's a 501c3 nonprofit that was launched in 2008 with a mission to engage underserved populations in the development and use of health information technology as a means to support and sustain health equity and economic viability based on NHIT's 5 pillars: workforce, innovation, policy, research, and community. NHIT works to ensure that both the needs of underserved communities and the communities of color are represented in the health information technology that are developed, and also to encourage the inclusion of entrepreneurship of these communities in the development of the next generation of health technologies. It is because of people of color that have been underrepresented in the development of these technologies that the adoption and use of these technologies and tools, which hold great promise, have not been realized. So when we talk about the drive of diversity and equity and inclusion and how it intersects with learning health systems, we need to look at how are we ensuring that underserved communities are at the table, are being funded, and are engaged in the development of these tools, and not just what I call underserved communities. Not just be looked at consumers of health, which is traditional. Take care of your diabetes, take care of your hypertension, but how do we actually and meaningfully think of underserved communities as being part of the production of health, having a seat at the table, and being part of the solutions. And that's where NHIT has focused our efforts since our inception.
Okay, I'll go next. Good afternoon. Good morning still, I guess, to everybody. My name is Danielle Brooks, and I am the Director of Health Equity for AmeriHealth Caritas family of companies, which is a managed care organization. And in my role, I am responsible for all things health equity. So what that means is I use data as an underpinning, but I create programs that support both our external audiences, so the communities that we serve, as well as our internal processes. So what that looks like is that I design, implement, and create strategy and programs to support our marginalized communities. Our company serves about 8 states, which various geographical locations. We actually have representation at Michigan. It's Blue Cross Complete is one of our sister companies. And there I'm actually on the ground working to support how can our organization from that managed care perspective really have an opportunity to not only look at racism as a public health crisis, but how does our role as that organization able to really make a difference in solving disparities, improving equity, not as an afterthought, but as an integrated part of the work that we do. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Hi, all. Good morning. My name is Melissa Creary, and I'm an assistant professor in health management and policy in the School of Public Health here at University of Michigan. I am really thrilled to be joining this esteemed panel and to be talking with you all today about hopefully strategies and action items about moving forward when it comes to an integration of diversity, equity, inclusion, questioning what that really is before we attempt to embed it into the learning health system. Before joining the University of Michigan, I was a health scientist at the CDC working to develop policies and programs for the Division of Blood Disorders, specifically for sickle cell disease. My research focuses on the intersection of health equity, justice, and policy development in Brazil and the United States. I work with health social movements and the community more broadly to answer questions about trust and citizenship and health. Most of my work centers around sickle cell disease, but I have been asked to speak a lot in the current moment about issues of health equity for communities of color concerning COVID-19, as you might imagine. As far as the learning health system, I work with Dr. Jody Platt to help lead and inform our LHS program. We are currently leading a team on the development of a paper that calls for an LC framework applied to the learning health system, informed by critical race theory and adapted from Chandra Ford's public health critical race praxis for anti-racist research. So in the developing of that paper, we know that the current healthcare ecosystem suffers from structural inequities and racism in the production and application of knowledge. And we are hoping to introduce anti-racist principles to the processes that we're talking about here today, which we're hoping to be embedded in the learning health system. I am looking forward to our conversation for this event.
Okay, I'm trying to start my video up, but it says, okay, start my video, there it goes. So look, I want to thank all of the three of you for joining us here, really, and for taking the time to prepare for this and sharing your experience with us. So, given the state of the world right now, what do you think are the biggest challenges you're facing or your organization is facing? And, as you think about trying to make data more actionable and put knowledge where it needs to go and some of these LHS type of things, ways that really are underpinned by active participation and benefit, the individuals that we're trying to really make happen in these communities, and the folks at the status quo has just not served well. What are the biggest challenges you're facing trying to make that happen, and how are you dealing with them? And I'll start with Danielle first, then Melissa, then Louise.
I'm trying to start my video. Okay. All right, there I am. So, that's a really interesting question, Joss, that you posed, because to your point, when I think about the space of health equity, racism, systemic oppression, and how it presents in healthcare, this is not a new concept. I think back to one of the, most cited first public documents by W. Du Bois, which was like the health of the Philadelphia Negro, I think it was called. And it was really one of those first publications that kind of took away this concept that African Americans were biologically inferior, and really talked about the role of social determinants of health, racism, and systemic oppression to the health of the Black community. And I start off with that because the truth is that as a society and as an industry, health disparities, health inequities have been known. And data has supported that year after year after year, not only from publications produced like from the IOM or the CDC, but also in just systems and offices in general. So I think when I think about the use of data and really how it presents, particularly in an organization that's a payer, I think we're hitting this precipice of really trying to figure out how to use that data in an actionable way, but also inject and understand that lens of systemic oppression and how that presents. So one of the biggest things that we talk about is how do we foster trust? From our side, we manage patients and then they go into the doctor's office, and that's sort of a black box of what happens. But we know a lot of things break down there. And so as we look at this data, it really is kind of reforming the use of the data so that we can have targeted approaches, but also be able to have those conversations and the strategies built around not only historic oppression, racism, and discrimination, but how it presents now and in the future. I think COVID has really kind of blown all of this open. So all of us that have been in health equity, Louise, Melissa, have just been banging the drum for years and being like, this is an issue. You need to, prioritize this. You need to make it actionable. You need to make it strategic. Now it's kind of this fever pitch to do it. And so it really is taking a look at that data, making sure it's being collected in the right way, making sure it's being analyzed in the right way. I think you referenced in the beginning of your conversation about AI and bias, making sure those folks are at the table so that those things are not, some of those issues can be alleviated in the beginning of the designs. And we're really targeting our approaches to make sure that it is community-led, community engaged, and really fitting those needs that are not only directly seen, but what I call the gray areas, those societal issues that are kind of impeding health equity for occurring. So I think, in short, it really is just making that data actionable, useful, but also giving people the power to really kind of think about this dynamically and how it can actually be used to impact the communities that we serve.
Okay, well, thanks. I really, I think that's exactly what we need. Just a quick interruption on the topic of making sure everyone's at the table. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, this is interactive, and we would love for you to submit your questions via chat, because we're going to be after I get through asking a few of my own questions to the great panelists, we're going to be turning over to your questions. So everyone in the audience, please submit your questions via chat, and we'll work on that. Melissa, what do you? You've been working, you've been working at Michigan. How have you experienced this?
Thanks, Josh. So it was a big question. This question that you've posed, and this question that I think is a challenge in and of itself. And I think it gets at several different issues. I think it gets at organizational challenges. I think it gets to issues around the actionable use of data, around data collection among underrepresented populations, and about the voices of underrepresented populations in research. And I am going to address the current moment that we are in that has led to the public declarations of racism as a public health issue, and see how many of these issues that you've talked about in your question to us hit. Right. So we know that we've got at the peak of the summer, this apex of COVID-19 and the racial injustices that I think got really brought us to a reckoning after the George Floyd killing, that all these municipalities began to claim racism as a public health issue. And so there are clear implications for data and the learning health system in these declarations, especially when we're thinking about the electronic health exchange that's becoming increasingly important between state health departments and hospital systems. And I think that this declaration offers us a real opportunity to collect data around the declaration that racism is a public health issue. But the real challenge is going to be taking it beyond this political and performative call that we're currently in, right? So right now we are seeing an uptick in all things equity-based, all things DE&I. What does that actually mean? We just saw, if you're at University of Michigan, in our record, that there's going to be a brand new call for anti-racist initiatives in which faculty are being hired, right? But what does that mean when the system is already eroded by these social injustices and modes of oppression? So we have to be able to, yes, be prepared to take us into a different kind of paradigm that embeds equity at all levels, that helps us when we're thinking about community engagement. It helps us with research design. It helps us with thinking about how data gets used and distributed and then reciprocated back into communities in meaningful ways. But simultaneously understanding that we are in a moment that is political. We are in a moment that is calling for a lot of performativity, and making sure that we take that moment that is giving us the space to do more, and understanding that we're going to have additional pressures to like really push the gas pedal past the performativity stage. So I see, and I know that the next question is going to be us talking about, well, what are some, positive things that we can see from this? And I definitely see racism as a public health issue, a double-edged sword of this political performativity piece that's going to challenge us on data, but also the other side of this is that it will give us the space to actually collect data and be held accountable.
Okay. Now, Luis, I mean, you've actually sort of been on the ground in like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, making things happen right in this space. So what's your take on this, given your experience and the experience of NIHIT?
Yeah, Josh, I think there's a couple of things I want to highlight. Back in 2015, we did a summit at the Humphrey Building celebrating the Hector Report. Right, that was 30 years since Secretary Hector issued her report that led to the establishment of the Office of Minority Health and IMHD and other efforts under President Ronald Reagan. But that was the beginning of that whole effort that led to establishment of a lot of the Office of Minority Health. Since that report, in 2015, there were over 30,000 reports documenting disparities in the country. So we've known about a lot of these disparities that now COVID has highlighted and brought to the forefront. The difference now is that we can no longer hide it, right? And some of the efforts that we've been leading in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico is trying to establish the health information exchange in the territories. They do not have health information exchanges, and the collection of that data is important to us, both to the territories, but to CDC and nationally. And I bring that because, I mention this because data is extremely important to what we're trying to accomplish, right? That we need to know which communities are being impacted, where are these not just impacted, but what's being done to do outreach into the communities. And that's a huge concern because there's still a lack of trust in our communities about what's being done with that data. So the messenger in all of these efforts matter, right? If we just go into the communities and we ask for the data, if we just are just seeking the data, but we don't have the local champions involved in these type of projects, we are missing a huge opportunity to not just have the community involved in solving the issues at the local level. We could potentially be building additional gaps in terms of trust in the communities. So we talked about earlier about AI. We know that AI in the justice system, for example, using AI, African-American males were getting higher bonds because of the algorithms that were being used to set bonds. So there's a real promise here using data and engaging communities to solve health equity. But there's also a huge mistrust that we need to deal with when it comes to diversity, who's involved in solving and how that data is being used.
Okay, so it's interesting because I mean I think we identified a lot of real challenges here that are, I guess the question so it leads to is we have all these challenges, and now we're facing some of the biggest public health crises we've ever faced as a whole world, and yes, it's affecting everyone, but it's affecting the people who are always left out so disproportionately. It's terrible. But the question is can this disruption, can it open some new doors? Can it create some new opportunities? Is there a way of leveraging what's going to have to get built to solve this crisis and I guess doing it in all the right ways that advance health equity. I guess Melissa, if you want to get started on that one, and then we'll do Luis and then Danielle, sort of keeping the order.
So Josh, you're asking us to think about taking advantage of this moment, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I do think that this moment that we're in, back to my other comment around racism being declared as a public health issue, really does give us a chance to be called to the carpet about how we collect data around racism. So now that it's being declared, and we know that we're going to be held accountable by the community and state health departments and county health departments, and when we think about small p policy and how we might be thinking about integrating anti-racist policies on small levels, because we know that we can't wait for the federal government. We know that we can't wait for the big P policy to trickle down to the community. So I think that a good thing that's coming from this moment is that we're able to capitalize on the fact that we are talking about this a lot more. We have to make sure that it's being talked beyond lip service, right? That we have people that are truly invested around the intentionality of what we do when we say that racism is a public health issue, and how that then gets embedded into policy. So I think that by virtue of declaring it, that it is going to highlight racism in a certain kind of way that will then lead itself to policy development and data collection, ways to engage with the community in particular kinds of ways that will, will be able to be held accountable based on those declarations to a larger body of people, to a community. And I'm hopeful that I know we talked about challenges, and so I don't want to, completely keep on the challenges, right? But one of the challenges is that this moment is going to call for so much lip service, right? So then we have this tension of this moment doing a really good thing for us in bringing attention to injustices, bringing attention to inclusion and diversity, but then it's our charge to make sure that we use this moment responsibly, that we use this moment to actually get the knowledge that we need to, understanding that this knowledge is going to take time. It's not going to be a one-stop shop where someone goes to one of these panels and gets information about diversity and equity, and then it's a done deal. This is about a long-term and hopefully sustainable process that has to take place by calling out racism and then doing the work for the learning health system.
So I want to come back to this whole concept of the production of health. I think it's extremely important, especially in this moment when we're talking about systematic racism. Part of that systematic racism is who has a seat at the table, not just a seat at the table, but a meaningful seat at the table. So when we're looking at this data, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the workforce, who's being hired to be part of these efforts? Who's being contracted? Who's receiving the awards? Our community-based organizations being funded, our entrepreneurs being funded to create some of these solutions, right? There's a huge opportunity right now to allow and create an entrepreneurship spirit and fund uh, small businesses from minority communities to be part of this. The problem is that capital does not exist. The problem is that traditionally organizations come into our communities and they'll say, give us your data, give us your data. And you know what? We will analyze it for you and we will give you a report. And thank you so much. Good job. Appreciate it. Here's the issue that you have in your community. But what they won't do is they won't fund our communities. They won't fund our entrepreneurs. They will not fund our community-based organizations, right? So we need to change that, right? And the folks even on this call could change that by when you submit a grant, make sure that our community-based organizations or that you have diversity in as on the grant, right? To make sure that it's not just us winning the award and to analyze social determinants of health or underserved populations, but you're not including us. And when I say you're included, you're not including us in the production of health. You're not including us meaningfully in the opportunities. And that's the biggest problem that we have. So I tell folks, you know, our African American brothers and sisters in the 60s, they fought for civil rights movements, right? And the Latino community also fought for the civil rights movement. The civil rights issue that we have, and we're in the middle of an election, so please go out and vote. But the real civil rights movement of our time is economic injustice. We could really have a tremendous impact on economic injustice if we have meaningful jobs, right? You could deal with health disparities if our communities are being hired, members from our communities are being hired. So I just say this: we have an amazing opportunity to stop the lip service, to stop doing the research. What the Hackler report did, over 30,000 research reports on disparities in the country. And we could actually start moving to delivery and including our communities in that. I guarantee you there's amazing people like Melissa and Danielle that will love some of these contracts, that will love to be part of these efforts. And that's the type of conversation that we need to continuously have. So when we're having a conversation of something like this about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we must also have the conversation about the business of health, which really means, hey, we want to be part of the problem, solving the problems. And by the way, we want to create the pipeline of our future doctors, our future health administrators, right? That's all part of this discussion. So we should not just have a discussion about COVID-19 and how is adversity impacting our underserved communities. We know that, right? The numbers are there. But we should also say there's a lot of opportunities here and we want to be included in solving the issues. We are available to serve the country. We're available to serve these projects.
If I could respond to Louise, and we can have a back and forth, and I'm hoping that this is going to also jog the audience to feel like you can have a back and forth with us as well. Louise, I 100% agree with you about who is coming to the table, who is being invited, who is being engaged from the very beginning all the way to the end, because at least in public health, there is a tremendous habit of helicopter research where you fly in, you get what you need, and then you dip out, right? And I want to push us even further to think about what happens when we invite people to this table. What happens when the table is janky? What happens when we are ignoring all of these underlying societal and structural things, which, Louise, you have talked about? The systemic racism has embedded into the bodies of the people who are at the table, such that there's a lack of capital, there's a lack of understanding each other's languages. And again, this engine of performativity brings people to the table but then we're not able to actually engage with them, or it's a superficial kind of situation where you come to the table and it doesn't really matter because I've taken your picture for the website. But when it comes to being able to actually get what we need from you, that part still, gets kind of shoved under the table. So I want to make sure that we are bringing folks to the table, but that we are also understanding all the things that are embedded in these bodies and how historic marginalization has then positioned these people who are at this table to not be heard, even though they're at the table. So there needs to be all these other processes. Louise, you want to say something? Say it. Let's do it.
Yeah, Louise, say something. Louise, you go, but I have comments. So
yes, Danielle,
I'll get a chance also. Then, yep.
Come in.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right, and I think the performativeness. I think that the fact that you're bringing that up is 100% accurate. It's also, I always ask, the conversation is so othering, even in the discussion paradigm that we're having, right? It's like the healthcare system, and then these groups that are, disproportionately excluded for all of the reasons that are described, for, unethical medical treatment, for taking information, not giving back, for underinvestment, for economics. But even the paradigm in which we're discussing, how can we bring these people into the fold, is problematic in its undertones, right? If this is a health system, you basically want to look at it as, this is the health system. You consistently have a percentage of your population that is underserved. That is the failure of the health system. And so I always turn it back on the health system and ask, what exactly is that, even that paradigm? Is that, do you just kind of accept that as a percentage? And that's just kind of how the system has worked. Now, the interesting thing about the policy piece, and I do agree with you, Melissa, I get nervous about these declarations as well, because the United States is very, very famous for having a very short memory, right? So we'll have these moments, we'll have these big things that happen, these declarations, these movements, and then with the flip of administration or a flip of the other thing, those things continue to get watered down until it becomes an add-on. So I have done this to satisfy the check of the box, but it does not mean meaningful change. So I do like the fact from the payer perspective about the public health declaration, not because I think it is this like golden panacea that's going to change anything. Anybody that's been in this field, knows better. But the interesting thing of what it is doing, and I can speak from the seat that I have at that organization, is that the way that they are requiring the payments for payers to be structured is topsy-turvy. So they're looking at this opportunity to say, rather than me hitting it on you for the HEDIS metric, so how do you, kind of manage your population, I'm actually going to pay you to see how much you can close disparities. That, when you tie economic incentive to legislation and the way that these organizations are paid, does move the needle. Now, it only moves the needle on one level. It doesn't talk about the D and the I, the diversity and the inclusion, but it does force that downstream reckoning. So I think that there is a carrot and stick opportunity, but I do think that organizations do need to think about even the languages that they use of, how do we get these people involved? It's, how do you stop discluding these people, because they are still people that you serve? And just that paradigm is just something that I think needs to be removed from that piece. And that's going to take a long time, because that comes from that systemic injustice and racism that we see.
I want to give Louise a chance to respond, and then I want to respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight from conversation that was going back and forth was, I've been doing this. We've been doing this collectively for a while now, right? One of the things that just I always find astonishing is when, whenever we're involved on an effort and we're doing a lot of pro bono, right? We're just doing it. And I've gotten this directly. We're told you're doing God's work. We get a pat in the back and we're told you're doing God's work. Keep up the amazing work that you're doing, right? as soon as I asked, or we asked, hey, is there an opportunity for us to get a contract, get a subcontract to work with you? We get, sorry, there's no money, in the budget for this. Perhaps next year, we'll put it in the budget, right? Or as soon as we ask those questions, we get, oh, you're not really qualified for this. But wait a minute, I just spent a long time building the strategy, right? So those are the type of things that I want to keep on bringing back home, because we know that if we're really going to make changes, we know that the messenger matters, right? Everything that Danielle and Melissa are talking about could be done. We can make a lot of changes, but the messenger matters, right? So I'll leave it at that. I could dive in. I've been, Josh, you've been to our Wall Street Summit, right? This is something that I'm constantly bringing up. But the good thing is, coming back to data, we're going to have really good data. And now the question is, how do we make it actionable? But at the end of the day, if our organizations and our community members are not at the table, not meaningfully engaged, funded, we will lose an opportunity to make a difference.
Hey, Josh, you made the mistake of asking us really deep questions and giving us like 40 minutes to answer. So, because we could all dive incredibly deep into our respective areas for hours, I'm sure.
For sure.
That's why you're here, is because everyone's brought that kind of experience. And I think that's exactly what we need. The audience has been really engaging on sending all kinds of great chat questions. So I'm gonna, continue with our plan. I'm gonna move to that pretty soon. But I wanted to pick up on a term. Melissa used the term helicopter research. I haven't heard that term before, but that's great. And I've heard that theme echoed throughout what Danielle and Louise have said. I basically remember the same concept, Louise, even going back to the Wall Street Summit, when you're engaging business communities and seeing the opportunities to invest in this. I guess one piece of public health advice I'll give is, don't do a drinking game that involves taking a drink every time the word infrastructure is mentioned at a learning health system conference, because learning health systems are all about not doing any kind of helicopter research, but doing, bringing together research and public health and healthcare sort of into one thing. And actually, the broadest learning health systems are starting to bring social services and things even outside of health for exactly that reason. And building, what they term, socio-technical infrastructures. How do you create something that actually lasts and stands the test of time? This isn't one more NIH-funded research project that you do the research and you finish and you move on to something else. You build things that last and stay there. I guess that's the question that I will pose is, learning health systems are being created and they are transforming things. How do we take that infrastructure concept and bring infrastructure to literally systemically addressing the systemic challenges that are causing DEI, that are causing everything you've brought up in the first place? And how do we create an infrastructure for DEI? I guess, and that's probably another deep question that I should be thoughtful about. But I'll ask that, and then continuing with our plan for the day, I'll be turning things over and starting to do some more audience questions.
Well,
I'll start.
I was just going to say, I think it's a great segue because one of our audience members, Kate Spector Baghdadi, has asked a similar question in the chat. Well, how do we get NIH to fund engagement projects like this? And Danielle, I'm going to yield the floor right now, but I'm going to say and come back to it that basically it's about changing the whole paradigm of how we think about this kind of research. We can't expect NIH to understand that in a 2-year period, we have to collect some sort of data when it takes 2 years to properly build the bridges for community engagement. So until we can get these higher level institutions to understand what community engagement really looks like, and the commitment to equity is about the time and the money, but a lot of time, then I don't know how we can engage to get NIH to begin to think about this. Everyone who's here, these 61 attendees that are left, you know, we all have to make sure they get a job at NIH.
Yeah, I think you actually set it up, and I'll echo that. I think you're right. It's always, in my perspective, in and outside of the research world, and now working as somebody that's to implement these things, the biggest really thorn in my side is that every time I look for an evidence-based approach, you'll see these time limits on it, right? So it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and there's no consistent data that tells me what the actual approach, the best evidence-based approach is. And that's because DEI is consistently viewed as this outward thing. It is not embedded in the beginning. So to Melissa's point, yeah, it's a different concept. It's a different way of building engagement. It's a different way of building trust. I've been working on this aspect in respective communities that I serve for 2 years now. We're just now getting to the point where people are actually wanting to be engaged in some of these questions because it takes that long. And so it has to be embedded. And I think rather than looking at it purely from a ethical standpoint, it's saying in your study, you're obviously missing the mark on a certain population. There's going to be a health equity issue. That should be solved and be embedded up front and solved for as you continue to go. Because if you do not, you will continue to see gaps in the strategies, in the research, and the pieces that you're developing in the technology. That's one, costly, and two, really doesn't provide much of a actionable way of addressing these issues, because you're going to have to come back and clean it up and figure out where you missed the mark. It has to be embedded up front as a principle, and it has to be solved up front as a principle. And that may extend studies, that may make them more complex, but until you do that, we're going to continue to see this divide. The thing that I always get asked in these conversations too, I'll say, is that the ROI on health equity, right? The ROI on it, which is a silly question. Again, you can look at the pandemic, you can look at prior health equity issues, and there's always a percentage of the population that is left underserved. And so to me, if you're looking at the ROI on this, that is where it is. And so we have to change the paradigm to put equity within everything we do, rather than it being an afterthought, or else these type of systems are for naught, and they'll just create greater divides.
Yeah, Luis, I know you thought a lot about ROI on equity. I mean, so it's perfect to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I just think that.
Explain what that is. ROI.
Return on investment. Yeah. Your investment.
So I just think that the days of just doing surveys and asking for data are over. I think the community, we're looking for actionable data items, right? How do we deliver it, right? How are we really making a change? What is it in for us, right? And I think that's what the social movement is at right now. If you get a researcher or somebody just saying, hey, give us your data, I think those days are over, right? I mean, I think the community is going to start pushing back on that. Now folks are starting to say, how are we using this to solve real world problems, right? How are we going to make a difference? What's the paradigm shift? And that's in essence where I believe where we need to be focusing on. We need to start focusing on the data that's available, right? I'm sitting on the Morehouse Health Equity Task Force. They're working with Google on a health equity map. I'm working on another project with Amazon on the NHIT dashboard. I see high tech, I see the data. A lot of the data sets are there. Think about the idea that some of these big companies have 3,000 to 4,000 data sets on all of us, right? They know more about us than, have you ever been on Facebook and something pops up? You almost think like, how did they know that, right? Data is here, we have data, but the question now becomes, how does that data become actionable, right? How do we put sensors in the homes of our seniors, right? How do we, to solve health equity issues, right? to solve transportation issues, to solve food deserts, right? And food deserts is not just a rural issue, it's an urban issue as well. So how are we moving from a data collection, everything is data, to make it actionable and making sure that our communities are part of that, those opportunities. And I could go on and on, as Danielle says.
Luis, I'm allowed to tease you because I've known you for a long time too. So you play the same rules as Josh does.
Well, so far, look, hey, we've made it, almost halfway through the panel. No one's interrupted anyone or told her to mute or told anyone to shut up. So we're doing better than some other folks have done in recent debates. We're now going to turn things over, to audience Q&A. Before we do that, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people. One is, within the Department of Learning Health Sciences, we have, real leadership happening on DEI, and I want to acknowledge, Cheryl Moyer and Maria Flores, who actually have been very involved in helping to think through this panel and in working on questions and trying to really bring in DEI to the forefront, and their leadership in the department and making DEI a central piece of what we're doing has been a huge. So I want to acknowledge both of them and thank both of them who are here right now helping actually with all the great questions that we're getting, thinking about how to do that. I also want to take a quick second to acknowledge the faculty and staff that work behind the scenes to make these collaboratories happen. Lisa and Kathy, you guys have been just absolutely extraordinary, and I can't figure out how many hours you must have put in. So I wanted to acknowledge the staff and all the work it takes to make these collaboratories happen, as myself and the panelists have learned firsthand. And that actually brings me to one of the audience questions that I wanted to get to, which is, from a community perspective. I'll turn it over to the Q&A. Sorry, that's there. From the community perspective, people are often asked to participate in research, and they don't get a direct benefit. And so we wanted to think about, how do you help people become more than just a data point in research and get them actively involved? And I think that'll be the first of the audience questions that I'll turn things over to as I'm monitoring the chat.
Is that question for me or?
Oh, I was gonna let it. And okay, any if you have enough thoughts, Louise, you can start. I was gonna let anyone who wanted. I was gonna sort of let anyone jump in who thought they had an instinct on it. But yeah, any of you guys, go ahead.
Can you repeat the question, Josh?
Yes.
Sure. Okay. Sure. Yeah. From the perspective of the people who are underserved, who are often asked to, I guess, participate in things that they don't get any direct benefit from. How can we change that? How can we, assure the people that you're trying to serve, really become more than just a data point when they contribute to it? And I guess, if you want closely related to that, there've been actually several questions about, how do you build trust in the system, and how do you sort of operationalize the trust that it takes to make this happen? And I think the two interrelate. So I'll mix a couple of audience questions together on that front.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that. I think that when these grants are written, right, or proposals are submitted, we do a good job at putting indirect costs and personnel and SMEs, right? But we don't leave an area for potentially compensating participants or compensating partners. And I think that those are the type of things that could be done very easily and should be done, right? You should strategically highlight that you want to compensate participants in, if you want to have roundtables, that you want to compensate community participants, that you want to have a community advisory board that will be compensated, or that you will hire a couple of SMEs from the community to make sure that the community is informed. One of the realities is that having community champions as part of a project makes a world of a difference, from you just asking the community for information. And I just believe that that's the difference when we start saying, how can we start changing? Is that a line item in those projects should be compensated community participation.
Yeah, and I'll talk about trust. The system has to work to earn it. I think that not only from a historical standpoint, I think that 1619 has a good little snippet of a podcast called Bad Blood. There's medical apartheid. There's tons of literature on it. But from a trust level that has been, I wouldn't say irreparably, but it's been pretty well damaged. And then you look at the current state of how health is delivered to populations of color. The best and most cited example is maternity health care. And so we really also have to look at those opportunities of how are we training the people that represent and work within the healthcare system to make sure that there is more representation, but really look at it beyond bias and discrimination training, but actually processes in place that make sure that, you know, where we know disparities occur, we can solve against that. But I think that it really comes to, as Louisa said, you know, they have to involve the community. You have to actually make an effort to invest back into what you're trying to take in order to make sure that you are actually able to build those bridges. And it's not something that's going to happen instantaneously. It's not something that because these declarations of public health and racism have come, that all of a sudden people are going to feel comfortable about it. So it's going to take a long time to build that up. But I think with the first step of recognizing the errors, solving against it, putting it, embedding that and tying that into medical degrees, into accreditation opportunities, into these payment structures, that's really how you're going to be able to push ahead in the system. But again, you have to engage in a meaningful way and give back to those communities that you're looking to evolve.
Yeah, and I think to that point, what I'm thinking about are, you know, part of how we engage communities is work, I think, on our part to, you know, not collect the data. Yes, maybe we meaningfully want to give it back. Yes, there may be some processes in place for, you know, moments of reciprocity. But I really feel like there's some work that needs to be done on the very front end to, for those that aren't already, and there are so many that are, very savvy about the idea of what data can do and the power behind data. But there are just as many community orgs who don't quite know what to do with research. What is the value of research? And understandably, there are lots of people who I think take advantage of that naivete, but there are people that really want to engage, as Daniel was saying, in meaningful ways, such that we can build these processes that communities are getting exactly what they need out of the data, back and using it back into their communities, using it to develop policies, using it for activism purposes, using it for all kinds of things. But I do think there still needs to be some work on the front end that involves an education of, well, why do we even care? Why should we even care about research? Why should we even care about data? I know that when you work with nonprofits or community orgs that are mostly about service delivery, it's hard to then switch that paradigm to go from service delivery to, well, what am I supposed to do with research, right? And then the onus is on us to begin to begin to have again a conversation that's going to take time. To have this conversation with the communities about why research is something that we should even invest in as a community org, as a community member. So I think that there's work to be done as we understand that trust is eroded, but also knowing that the time that it takes to work on that trust has to be a conversation in which we even baseline educate folks about what this data can actually do for you. Because in a lot of instances, there is an immense amount of power with data that can be pumped back into the communities. But if you don't know that or understand it, and there are plenty that do, but for those that don't, I think that education still needs to happen. Louise, I saw you wanting to say something.
Yeah, can I level set on something, because I know it's a different topic, but it relates to trust and data. This is a story about a lady called Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks has gone through her genome, DNA, has done so much for the world, right? There's industries that have been built around her, close to that, billions of dollars. Most of us are benefactors of that research. But her family never knew, right, that that she was the person, she was the one behind this. So I'm highlighting this because here you have a family that has never been compensated, where NIH refuses, a couple of years ago, said, we're not going to compensate, right? And to me, I see that as an injustice, right? As an injustice. How a family should have been compensated. There should have been, and I know there's a foundations bill, but this is generational wealth, kind of the way I see it. And all the pharmacy companies that benefited from this, they should have been compensating this family. That's my personal view, but it's the reality. Now we have data, and data is the new gold mine in our country, right? And there's a lot of companies that are going to benefit from data. The question is, how are our communities going to be benefiting from our data ourselves? So I just mentioned that because those are the underlying ugliness, untruths, unspoken truths in our communities that we're thinking about, right? We're thinking our communities, the lack of trust, these injustices that have not been undone, right? That are reality, and we should be mindful of that. And I know some of these things are not sensitive or easy topics, but they are realities, and we should be discussing them.
And I think even beyond that, if I were to add one more thing, we can also just look at the power of a story. So when you really think about trust, and you have a particular clinic, office, provider, and that person has done something to somebody in the community, your family, and it's been over and over again. Maybe they have discriminatory practices. Maybe they have bad outcomes for a certain population. Maybe you don't like the way they talk. That in itself can erode that community and their trust in that system, particularly if there's not a lot of other available options. So then that information is passed down and it's spread, and it becomes endemic, and it continues to build upon this foundation of injustice. So I also want to make sure that we are very, very cognizant of that. It's not just the Henrietta Lacks, it's not just the disease, it's not just the radiation, it's not just the birth control experiments and so on and so forth. There are those opportunities, and it starts to couch that expectation of what to expect when you encounter these things. And it begins to really, again, reinforce that knowledge. And so that has to be rebuilt again. So all of these opportunities are opportunities to build trust in these interactions, and honest trust. But let's not bury it and think that this is a historical thing. It's a very much real-time thing that occurs. And we need to make sure that we're cognizant of those realities at this time as well.
Okay. So, that brings up an interesting point. One of the panelists said, that with DEI, we left out the A, and the A she was referring to was one of the audience members said that the A we left out is accessibility. She was thinking specifically about sort of the disability community and making sure things are accessible to people with disabilities. But so I want to ask that question if any of you have direct experience with, with making things accessible to the disability community. But then I also wanted to go more broadly to, let's see where I have it, the learning health system, the core value of accessibility, which is that all should benefit from the public good derived from the LHS. It should deliver value to all, incentivizing broad participation. And that's sort of a very different view of accessibility. But the relationship there is, how do you bring people in, and how do you do this equitably and fairly, for exactly that reason. So I'll take that question, build on it, and turn it over to anyone who wants to answer. First on the, engaging the disability community front, and then second, more broadly, on the question of accessibility.
Disability is hard for me to answer, and I'll turn it to my colleagues as well,
Okay.
because when we think of disability, there's so many factors to consider.
Okay.
There's cognitive, there's physical, there's unseen. So that's a difficult question to answer, but I think that a lot of what we discuss is parallel across that, right? So I think this conversation, when we think about diversity and equity inclusion, people tend to immediately go towards communities of color, marginalized communities, but there is an intersectionality there that often is not necessarily always recognized, and there's a lot of groups that are often not thought of automatically. So I think the question is great about disability, also about sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, age, pre-existing conditions. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice the needs of people. But I would say a lot of the things that I've held true and what I've said about making sure that those spaces are at the table and that you are investing in them and giving back to them and creating trust as well. Because I think that from a historical standpoint, there has been a lot of discrimination in that space. And there's currently discrimination kind of coming up the pipeline now with a lot of the erasures of the 1557 law and how that impacts individuals with disability. And so I would just say that a lot of the comments that I've stated about those inclusion pieces, when we think of DE&I, we need to think about it as broad as possible and as multifaceted as possible. And then also understand that intersectionality of, yes, you can be a woman of color and you can have a disability and you can be a sexual minority. And all those factors do influence the way that you experience life and you experience society. And that just calls for not thinking about things in such binary terms, but really kind of expanding the way that we think of DE&I, that inclusion and how it impacts the communities that we serve.
A good time to expand and say, I think that also probably needs to include, in really building these broad people that come from different walks of life, people that have different kinds of occupations, different kinds of religious beliefs, different kinds of experiences and where they grew up, sexual orientations, different political beliefs too. We really need lots at the table. And
it's really about person-centered care, right? It's about really looking at that person and the dynamics that they bring and that they have and their perspectives and value. And having that kind of really dynamic person-centered, it makes the data capture and research fields more intense, but I do think that we don't want to, for the sake of trying to get the best answer for the best person, ignore those multifaceted pieces of a person's personality and background.
Yeah. No, in fact, almost can you use the concept of learning health systems? Can you collect enough data, engage enough people, think about things much more broadly than just pure healthcare data to get social determinants, to get things like where someone's from, what their beliefs are, how they grew up? Can you actually build empathy into a health system in that way? Can you really build a real true understanding of people?
And I think the second coin of that is bias.
Get rid of bias, build an empathy. Yeah.
Hey, Josh, and I think that leads us to the positive side of data, right? That leads, it's very hard and negative on some of the other stuff, but there's a promise here, right? The reality is that we now have the data. We know what are some of the social determinants of health data. And we could, on one of the projects that we're working on, is how do you really analyze an entire community, not just an ethnicity, right? Access, transportation, all these other components, because at the end of the day, just like everything comes down to the local community, right? If there's not walkways, if there's not transportation and access, right? If the local post office does not have a ramp for somebody on the wheelchair, those are the type of things that have an impact on our communities in the daily lives, right? So I think data could allow us to really use mapping to really highlight what's going on in a particular community. And then strategically, then you could put together an outreach effort, or you could try to influence policy, right? Whether it's access or broadband, right? All these things we can now start diving into, right? And that's the type of work NHIT is doing right now, trying to figure out how can we really analyze communities and hone in on some of these things, because it's a lot of this is at the end of the day is going to come down to what's the outreach into particular communities, and how do you identify underserved and health equity in some of these social challenges at the local.
Yeah, one of the audience members just sent the quote in saying, disability activist Patricia Byrne, before we start designing ways to get to the moon, can we just make sure everyone on my block can actually get to work? And I think actually expanding that beyond just thinking about the disability community, I think that maybe an analogy, before a learning health system is just about take a DNA test and figure out, which, based on, these genetic factors, which combination of drugs is going to work right for you if you get COVID. Let's make it more broad and say, how do we get someone to the health they need, and that includes understanding that they live in a food desert and they can't get good nutrition, they don't have transportation, they don't have this resource or that resource, or this is a factor of their community, this is a factor of, it gets to the social determinants. But can learning health systems start to build that in as their sort of, ironically, can that be the moonshot of learning health systems, is to really get people to health, taking a very big view of what it takes to get there and designing things that way.
I just want to point people to the chat if they're not going there. There's excellent questions and comments and people engaging with it back and forth.
Yep. Including a plug, by the way, for our own health information and health program, health infrastructure and learning systems program. That's all about helping teach people some of these tools to be able to do some of this stuff. So there's a plug there in our, building this and building it together, that some of the skill sets being learned from Hills is worth doing. And people in this audience might want to look at our Hills program. I guess one of the other questions in the audience related to, going into building on the food desert, what I mentioned, going into sort of what this audience person called unplugged spaces. How do you collect data serving people that live in these unplugged spaces, and how do you make that happen? So I'll see if that's a way to go from here.
Unplugged spaces. I think I'd like that to be unpacked a little bit, but
limited connectivity, among other things. Really. So maybe digitally redlined places, rural places where people literally don't have access to a lot.
Okay, so this is a digital
divide kind of digital divide kind of question. Yeah, that it's another accessibility question building on something we've been discussing about accessibility.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I do think that that's the kind of nuance that has to be considered when we're talking about engagement, right? That, to Daniel's point, these intersectional communities, but these really hard to reach communities, not hard to reach because I don't trust you, but like literally hard to reach because I can't access you. Yeah. And I think that really just speaks to a more on the ground kind of engagement that needs to happen when it comes to making sure that folks are engaged in the research. And there are people who are doing this work. Certainly, what comes to mind is Vanderbilt's um, um, institute around community engagement, and I know all of their work that they've done around engaging really hard to reach communities. And Danielle and Louise, I'll yield before to you if you have other suggestions or things to add around that.
I just wanted to pause for 1 second. One side, a few members of the audience have pointed out the chat is available to all of us panelists. It's not available to the whole audience. So the folks who are behind the scenes making all this happen, if you could make sure to save copies of the whole chat, so we have every question, and somehow we'll find a way to make that available to everybody, that would be great. And I thank everyone for engaging in this really active dialogue on the chat, and look forward to doing that. Okay, back to Danielle and Louise.
You guys didn't even know that you were riffing off each other, because it seems like a total
I thought they could see it. That's actually interesting, the digital divide. That's actually, I'll speak from the payer's perspective, although to be fair, I've only been in the payer's perspective for a small chunk of my career. This has been a really significant issue. So really, as this pandemic has shown, not only is it just like the telehealth digital divide, but it also is, when we come back to economic support and support of children, it really is examining, can children continue to go to school? Can people successfully work at home if they have that capability? Do they have the technology? If we try to do a video visit, does your phone have the bandwidth, enough information, enough digital whatever? It really is an underpinning. And so I think this is similar to a lot of other things that we need to consider. So as we look at making the health system more equitable, it has to work side by side with housing policy. It has to work side by side with broadband. It has to work side by side with food and environmental, transportation. And so I think that this digital divide is, again, another important piece to really examine, to make sure that individuals do have that access, because we do know our community is engaged. They are high engaged users of this piece of information. But then again, it comes to making sure that the technology is in the hands, it's able to be used. And then also to make sure that for individuals where English is not their preferred or primary language, or they may have sensory disabilities that may impact their use of the technology, to make sure that those things are there at their fingertips so they're able to use it. So again, it's about designing the system that fits for everybody in the nuances of this, versus just trying to have like a generic population care approach and then wondering why half the users didn't respond. And so there's so many opportunities. And I do think that the more that we can enable folks to have access at multiple points, the more health and improvement we'll have in our communities.
It's so interesting that this topic is coming up. We're NHIT, we're working on launching the telehealth health equity coalition, and part of the new dashboard is building the telehealth consumer index. So we're spending a lot of time using the platform of the dashboard, which is part of Socrata, using open data from the government, FCC data, and others. We're really trying to figure out, mapping where the hotspots, who has access to broadband, both rural and in urban communities, because this is the big topic, right? The reality is that folks cannot participate in telehealth if they don't have access to broadband, or they don't have access, right? A lot of you see a lot of news reports now in underserved communities where you saw kids going to Wendy's or going to McDonald's to do their homework. If you go to different places, you go to McDonald's right now, there's a mother there with her kids doing the homework, right? So there's real concerns about what does it mean, access and from a telehealth perspective, right? But access to broadband in general, because then, as Neil said, a lot of the things that in this COVID world, everything is online, right? But if folks don't have access to the internet, uh, that's a huge, you're talking about a digital divide. That's a huge, has a huge impact in our community.
Okay. So we have about really only about 4 minutes left now. I guess, I wanted to wrap up by saying one is actually, I wanted to raise one more point that was made by the audience, which I guess we're not going to have time to answer, but is really, oftentimes the categories, can, and big data can take very diverse groups like all African Americans, let's say, and lump everyone together. And we want to think about how not to do that. I think the points that were made about learning health systems and personalizing things and empathy is a starting point, and I think that's something else to think about. So I wanted to make sure that point was raised because I thought it was such a good one that came up in the Q&A. I wanted to close, if each of you could just take 30 seconds to think of sort of one really key takeaway that you've heard today, that this group that we're here, which is people across 10 different schools or more at Michigan, plus the sort of network that we've convened on, international groups on mobilizing computable biomedical knowledge, and really, major convenings happening here, thought leaders on ethics. What sort of one actionable thing that we can take away that we can continue this? This doesn't become a one-off session, but this becomes something that gets built into the fabric of what we're doing. And I apologize for giving everyone like 30 seconds each to go on that. Whoever has an idea, go first, and then I'll call on the other two.
I would like to go last.
Yeah,
I can last. Luis, you go first.
Luis, you got stuck. Sorry. Just, one key takeaway from your experience, one actionable thing people should be doing that makes a difference.
I'm just going to restate what I've been trying to drive home.
Okay.
Inclusion, right? Making sure that the community champions are part of everything we do is extremely important. We're really going to make a difference. We got to have the communities that we are serving at the table, working with us to solve issues in their own communities.
Okay.
Okay, I get second.
You got second. Most was fast.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer your last question. So that person said, they lump all African Americans in a group. That's why ethnicity is important to collect as well as geographical location, language, and dialect. So if you can have that information within your cohort you're studying, that is a crucial way of having a better pointed type of information additional with other data like LGBTQ, orientation, gender identity, disability, et cetera, so forth. So that's over there. But if I had to have somebody, some takeaway, just like, do not think of equity as a separate piece. It is literally a component that should be built in all research, all LHSs, at the forefront. So however that needs to be constructed with community engagement, diversity and equity and inclusion and those folks that are at the table, it has to be at the forefront. If you don't, then you're going to be missing not only great opportunities to close the gap, but you're going to not be able to have the most effective approach possible because you will be leaving out checks. So that would be my point.
Okay, so first I'd like to say that I do recognize that we didn't get to some of the questions, and that I'm certainly available on Twitter or otherwise if you'd like to engage further with lots of these excellent, amazing questions. I see one by one of my PhD students that I would, of course, we can engage outside of this, but I think the thing I would like to drive home, and Luis, thank you for setting the tone of not necessarily answering the question, but but putting my own agenda up front. And that is that I think we have to be willing to problematize issues of justice and issues around equity, that we can't just accept them carte blanche, that we can accept that we understand that there's going to be nothing but lip service because of this moment, but then to take pause, to be willing to have the conversation of unpacking it, and to do the hard work of problematizing, is this really equity? I also think that to what everyone else is saying in terms of making sure it's not an outside process has to be key. But even when we're thinking about attempting to do this in a right way, and mistakes are happening all the time, right? There's no right way. But when we're thinking about what equity looks like when we embed it from the top to the bottom, that we're willing to alter and change and continue to have dialogue to say that no, that actually this is Band-Aid. This is just a Band-Aid thing that's not getting at how we actually infuse equity into the community in a way that is meaningful to them. And so there really is this issue, which we haven't talked about yet, this cultural humility piece of when we're engaging in the learning health system, when we're engaging in data collection, when we're engaging in all these ways that we want to do better, and we're coming from a really great space, how we really do have to take step backs throughout the entire process to question, to reconfigure, to re-navigate, to invite more people to the table, to be willing to disinvite people to the table, all of those things. We could talk about this forever, as you know.
And though we won't talk about it forever today, I think we should keep talking. I think we should make this part of what we do forever. So I think that is the most important outcome of today, is that this is not a dialogue that ends at now two minutes over this afternoon, but keeps going and going. Continues the dialogue, and more importantly, continues some, Luis especially, I think, has emphasized real concrete actions that make talk into things that really impact people's lives, and bring people to the table. So thank everyone for attending. Thank our exceptional panelists. Thank the LHS DEI leadership folks, and thank the people who work behind the scenes to make this so amazing. You have no idea how much work this took on the part of the people who did the things behind the scenes, and how many emails and how much work they did. And I'm really grateful to everybody for the time and for the effort. You're going to get a survey when this is over with. Please fill out the survey. You'll be able to get the materials, including the slide deck, and the on the website. Be sure to tune in on November 12th, which is coming up pretty soon, but there'll be an election between now and then, so who knows what'll happen. But be sure to tune in on November 12th for our next collaboratory. And again, let's really make this something that we keep doing. Let's see, in everything we do about learning health systems, every collaborative, let's see if we can just take just a little step towards making the world a little more just place, and righting some wrong and creating some new good thing. And if we can do that, and just baby steps along the way, with equity at the center of everything we do from now on, we can really make a difference. So thank everyone, and let's keep this going. Let's make this the start of something.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.